There is a specific moment that changes everything, and it almost never looks the way people expect. It is not loud, it is not dramatic. It is the quiet second when someone who was used to being at the center of another person's world reaches out, expecting the usual response, and finds nothing there. No reaction, no defense, no pull, just distance. And in that stillness, something they assumed would always be available is suddenly, unmistakably gone. If you have ever wondered what actually happens inside a person who spent months or years assuming you would always be there, always forgive, always come back, then stay with me, because what follows is not about revenge and it is not about hatred. It is about understanding. And understanding is the thing that finally sets you free. Before we go further, if this is the kind of clarity you have been searching for, consider subscribing. This channel exists to help you make sense of patterns that once left you confused, exhausted, and doubting yourself. Not to feed anger, but to hand you the psychological tools to protect your peace. That is the whole purpose here, and if that matters to you, you belong in this space. Let us begin with something important. Not everyone who behaves in self-centered, manipulative, or controlling ways has narcissistic personality disorder. That is a clinical diagnosis made by professionals based on specific and enduring criteria. What most people encounter in daily life are narcissistic traits or narcissistic behaviors, which exist on a wide spectrum and can appear in many people to varying degrees. So, when we talk here about a narcissistic person, we are talking about patterns of behavior, not delivering a diagnosis of anyone in particular. This distinction matters because it keeps us honest and it keeps us focused on what you can actually observe rather than what you can only guess about someone's inner world. With that in mind, let us look at the assumption that sits underneath so much of this behavior. There is often an unspoken belief that certain people will simply always be available, always reachable, always willing to absorb, to excuse, to explain away, to come back around after the storm passes. This is not necessarily a conscious calculation. In many cases, it may function more like an expectation built over time, reinforced every single time the pattern repeated and the other person returned. When someone comes back 100 times, the 101st time starts to feel guaranteed. And this is where the miscalculation begins. Because availability is not the same as permanence. A person can return again and again, right up until the moment something inside them shifts. And that shift is rarely visible from the outside beforehand. It can look like patience one day and complete withdrawal the next, not because the change was sudden, but because it was building quietly the entire time, unseen and unacknowledged. Consider how boundaries are often treated within these dynamics. A boundary is frequently interpreted not as a firm limit, but as an opening bid in a negotiation, something to be tested, worn down, waited out. In many cases, the underlying belief may be that boundaries are temporary, that enough pressure, enough charm, enough guilt, or enough persistence will eventually cause them to collapse, just as they may have collapsed before. So when a boundary is stated, it is not always heard as a decision. Sometimes it is heard as a challenge. This is why the tools come out, and it helps to understand what those tools actually are, because naming them removes their power. There is charm which can arrive suddenly and intensely, often at the exact moment distance appears. There are apologies, which may sound sincere, but frequently focus more on restoring the connection than on genuinely understanding the harm. There is guilt, applied carefully, designed to make you feel responsible for the discomfort of the other person. There is intimidation, sometimes subtle, sometimes not, meant to make the cost of holding your position feel too high. And there are promises, often sweeping and emotional, describing a future that somehow never quite arrives. Here is what unites all of these strategies. They are attempts to restore access, And access is the currency that matters most in these dynamics. So, what happens when these strategies stop working? This is the moment the title points to, because for a long time the pattern worked. The apology landed, the charm reopened the door, the guilt pulled you back, and then one day it does not. You do not argue, you do not explain, you do not re enter the cycle. You simply do not respond the way you always did before, and that produces something that can genuinely resemble shock. But we have to be careful and precise about what that shock actually is, because this is where people often misunderstand their own experience. It is tempting to interpret that reaction as remorse, as the long awaited realization, as proof that the person finally understands what they did. And sometimes, in some cases, genuine reflection may occur. Human beings are complex, and change is possible. But there is a crucial difference between genuine remorse and the discomfort of losing control. Genuine remorse is oriented toward the other person. It focuses on the harm caused, on the impact, on the reality of what someone else experienced. It does not require anything in return. It can coexist with accepting that the relationship may not continue. The discomfort of losing access is different. It tends to center on the self, on what is being lost, on the disruption to a familiar source of attention, admiration, reassurance, or influence. It is oriented toward getting the connection back, not toward understanding why it broke. And it often intensifies precisely when the door begins to close, rather than in the quiet moments when honest reflection would actually be possible. Learning to tell these apart is one of the most protective skills you can develop, because it stops you from mistaking someone's distress at losing you for evidence that they finally see you. Now, why do consequences feel so threatening in the first place to someone accustomed to avoiding them? For a person who has grown used to sidestepping accountability, consequences can feel less like a natural outcome and more like an attack. Accountability requires sitting with an uncomfortable truth about oneself. It requires acknowledging fault without immediately deflecting, minimizing, or reframing. For someone whose sense of self may be more fragile than it appears, that experience can feel genuinely destabilizing. So the reaction to a consequence is sometimes not reflection at all, but resistance. An urgent drive to make the consequence disappear rather than to understand why it arrived. And this is where loss of access reveals something that was often hidden all along. It exposes the difference between entitlement and genuine attachment. Genuine attachment can let go with grace, even through pain. It can respect another person's decision even when it hurts. Entitlement cannot, because entitlement was never really about the other person as a whole human being. It was about what that person provided. When the provision stops, the reaction can reveal what was actually being valued. Not you in your fullness and complexity, but your function, your availability, your role. Sit with that for a moment, because it answers a question that may have haunted you. The intensity of someone's reaction to losing you is not automatically a measure of how much they loved you. Sometimes it is a measure of how much they relied on what you provided. Let me pause here, because if any of this is landing, if you are starting to see patterns you lived through described in plain language, then this channel was built for you. Subscribe so you can keep learning to recognize these dynamics before they cost you your peace again. Understanding is protection. That is what we are building here together. Now, here is something you may need to hear directly. You do not need to prove anything. You do not need to prove that you were hurt. You do not need to prove that you were right. You do not need to construct the perfect explanation, deliver the flawless final confrontation, or make the other person finally understand. That impulse is deeply human, and it makes complete sense. Because for a long time, you may have been made to feel that your perception was unreliable, that your feelings were exaggerated, that you were the problem. Wanting to be understood after that is natural. But here is the quiet truth. Your freedom does not require their comprehension. In fact, Silence, distance, and calm detachment often communicate more than any confrontation ever could. Not because they are weapons, and this is important. They are not tactics for revenge, but because they represent something a manipulative dynamic cannot easily process. Non participation. The old pattern needs your engagement to function. It runs on your reactions, your explanations, your emotional investment in being understood. When you stop supplying those, the machinery has nothing to run on. The most powerful response in many cases is simply refusing to play the old game. To understand why walking away can be so difficult, we need to talk about something that operates beneath conscious awareness. It is a pattern researchers describe as intermittent reinforcement, and understanding it may explain something you have long blamed yourself for. When rewards are delivered unpredictably, when affection, warmth, and approval come sometimes but not reliably, the attachment that forms can become surprisingly strong. Stronger in some ways than attachment formed through consistent kindness. The unpredictability itself creates a kind of hopeful vigilance. You keep waiting for the good version to return, the one you glimpsed at the beginning, the one who appears just often enough to keep the hope alive. This is not weakness. This is a well-documented feature of how human attachment can be shaped by inconsistent reward. If you have wondered why you stayed, why you kept hoping, why it was so hard to leave something that hurt, this may be part of your answer. And it is not a character flaw. It is a pattern. And patterns can be understood. And once understood, they lose much of their grip. That is the turning point. Recognition itself changes the dynamic. The moment you can see the pattern for what it is, the moment you can name the charm as a strategy to restore access, the guilt as a lever, the sudden warmth as something that tends to appear right when distance does, the spell begins to weaken. You are no longer inside the story, you are looking at it, and you cannot be pulled by a current you can clearly see. So, let us talk about where your attention should actually go, because this matters more than anything else. It should go toward you, toward your safety, your stability, your boundaries, and your healing. Not toward waiting, because here is a trap that catches so many people. The trap of waiting for regret. The fantasy that one day the other person will fully understand, will feel the weight of what they did, will offer the acknowledgement that finally makes it all make sense. It is an understandable longing, but it can quietly keep you tethered to them, because as long as you are waiting for that moment, part of you is still oriented toward them, still watching, still hoping, still, in a sense, participating. Your healing cannot be contingent on their transformation. And this leads us to something subtle but essential. You may have learned over time to read the other person's reactions as a measure of your own worth. When they were warm, you felt valuable. When they withdrew, you felt diminished. Your sense of self may have become tied to their approval, their attention, their mood. This is one of the most damaging effects of these dynamics, and it can persist long after the relationship ends. But their reaction was never an accurate measure of your worth. It was a measure of their needs in that moment. When you stop interpreting their behavior as a verdict on your value, something profound shifts. You take back the authority to define yourself. You stop outsourcing your worth to someone who was never a reliable judge of it. This is what reclaiming emotional autonomy actually means. It is not coldness. It is not indifference. It is the return of your center of gravity to yourself. It is the ability to feel steady regardless of whether the other person is pleased, disappointed, charming, or furious. It is standing in your own life without your emotional state being controlled from the outside. And now we arrive at the real heart of this, the insight that reframes everything the title suggested. We began by imagining the moment a narcissistic person realizes they should not have done what they did. And it is natural to want that moment, to imagine it, to feel that it would bring some kind of closure or justice. But here is the truth that changes everything. That moment is not your turning point. Your turning point is different and it is far more powerful because it belongs entirely to you. Your turning point is the moment you stop needing their regret in order to move forward, the moment their realization becomes irrelevant to your peace, the moment you understand that your freedom was never in their hands and never should have been. Because if your healing depends on them finally understanding, then you have handed them the key to your recovery, and that is a key that may never be turned. Some people never arrive at that realization. Some do, but too late to matter. And waiting for it can cost you years you will never get back. So, the freedom is this: you get to move forward without the closure. You get to heal without the apology. You get to build a steady, grounded, self defined life, whether or not they ever look back and understand what they lost. Their comprehension is not the price of your peace, and it never was. Let that dissolve the waiting inside you. You do not have to stand at a door that may never open, hoping for words that may never come. You can turn around and walk into your own life. If this has given you even one moment of clarity, do something for yourself right now. Subscribe to this channel, like this video, and keep watching the content here about narcissistic behavior, emotional boundaries, healing, and self-awareness. Not because it feeds anger, but because understanding is the foundation of freedom, and you deserve to keep building on it. So, let us return one last time to the title, and let us leave it transformed. The most important moment was never going to be theirs. It was always going to be yours. Not the moment they realized they should not have done what they did, but the moment you realized you no longer needed them to realize anything at all. That is where the control ends. That is where the pattern breaks. That is where you become unreachable by the old strategies, not because you built a wall of anger, but because you built a life on ground they cannot touch. Their reaction is no longer your mirror. Their regret is no longer your goal. Their access is no longer available, and its absence is no longer your loss. It is your recovery. You were never as controllable as they assumed. And now you know it. Carry that with you because it is the truest kind of freedom there is, and no one can take it back.